In this first PhotoFlow tutorial, we will learn the basic usage of the program, in particular how to open an image, how to add layers and some layer mask, and how to save the result. So let's start by taking a raw file that we want to edit. Now, when opening the raw file, the program starts to process it to prepare the preview image, a pre-computed preview image. So while this is doing it, this little square is red, and then when it's finished it will turn green. And you have also seen that here on the left you have a panel where you have the histogram for your image for the blue, green and the red channels, and a list of layers. And when opening a raw file, there are two layers which are included by default. One is the layer that loads the raw data, and the second layer is the one where all the processing of the raw data to create the image that we see on screen is performed. Now let's first of all change the zoom to fit so that we can see the full image. So you see here on the bottom you have the controls to switch to zoom in and out, to zoom to fit the image in the screen, and to see the image at the 100% level, and two additional buttons that allows you to switch on the clipping warning for the shadows and the highlights to check that you are not getting your shadows into complete black or your highlights in pure white while you do the edits. Okay, so to access the various controls of the raw developer, one has to go to this layer and double click on the name, and this will open a panel on the right where all the controls of this specific tool can be accessed, and this is true for all the tools that one can add here in the layer stack. The parameters for the raw processing are very standard. You can change the camera white, you can change the white balance. For example, here we can select one of the presets, the direct sunlight, because I assume this picture was taken during the day. And you can also apply some correction to these presets. For example, in this case we can reduce a little bit the blue channel to get a slightly warmer image like this, or you can stick to the camera white balance, which looks not so bad. Then you can here change the exposure of the image, add or remove some exposure. You can choose between different demosaic methods. The default amaze is good for images which have low noise, and you have two more options which are good for images that are taken at higher ISO level and therefore which have more noise in the pixels. And finally you can also choose the way the colors of the image are rendered. You can choose between the default matrix profile for the camera, and here instead you can load a custom profile for your camera if you have it from a different software or if you calibrated the camera yourself. And also here you have a few options to choose among for the working color space. We will stick to sRGB for the moment, but you can play with it, and those two options have a larger gamut is called. It means they can accommodate and edit colors which are more saturated compared to sRGB, but since we want to prepare this picture for the web, this choice is okay. Good. Now let's have a look at the picture. It looks quite flat and dull, but this is okay for the moment. If we look here in the histograms, we see that we still have a room in the shadows and in the light highlights. There are no pixels which are complete black or pure white, so we still can work on the contrast of the image, and so all the information is there. We just have to pull it out. So let's first add a group layer here, which I will call edit, and will contain all the editing steps that we will be performing. And then as a first step, I want to improve the contrast in the image. So I choose this tool here. I hit OK. So to add a new tool, I went to this plus button, and then I get this dialog where we can choose among a certain number of tools. There are some tools which are more or less related to the color, to the editing of the color and of the tone of the image. You have some tools to change, to act on the details, to blur, to sharpen, and so on and so forth. You have some tools which allows you to change the geometry of the image. You can crop it, you can scale it, and you can correct the perspective, for example. Here you can have all the tools that are in a way or another useful to create layer masks. I will come back to layer masks a bit later. And you have also some tools from GMIC, and some other tools here that we'll see in some other tutorial. Okay, now as I did before, I double click here and I get access to the controls here, for where I can change the brightness, the contrast, the saturation of the image, and in this specific case I want to increase the contrast. Now, while doing that, it's a good idea to switch on these clipping warnings, just to make sure that we are not going too far. And indeed we see that this is the case, especially in the shadows. Now all this part which is shown in light blue is in reality completely black. So we have completely lost the detail in this region here. And if I push the the contrast even further, we see that we also start to get pure white regions here in the sky. But in fact, now if I switch this off, we can see that at a moderate contrast, this region here looks quite okay. I mean, if I switch off this layer and back on, we see that we get quite some improvement in this region. So what we really want to do is to get this nice improvement in contrast here without losing the detail in the shadows. And for the highlights, you see that the sky gets quite a nice structure now, so probably we will leave it like that. Now this tool has fortunately some more power in it, and in particular it provides some curves that allow to modulate the effect of all these sliders based on other features of the image. And in fact so you can modulate these adjustments based on the color of the image, on the saturation of the image, and on the lightness of the image. And what we want to do in this case is in fact to get this contrast adjustment maximum in starting from the midtones, and get it to 0 where we go in the shadows. And now let me enable this kind of curve to see the effect. Voila. So what we see is that now in this region here and in the sky, the adjustment is applied completely, but here in this dark region, this adjustment is the contrast is basically not changed. We can see that by switching on and off this tool, and if I disable this curve, now you see the effect in the dark regions. So as you can see, the things look much nicer now, and you can also with this button actually show the mask which is created by this curve, which is here. So where it's red, it means that the adjustment is not applied. So the contrast in this red region is set to 0, and where the mask is transparent, like here in the sky and in most of the trees, then the contrast is applied, the contrast adjustment is applied to the maximum value of 40, and in between, like for example here, the contrast is applied only by a factor of 20. And now let's zoom in a little bit more to see exactly this mask, and what we can see is that this mask is rather sharp. Yeah? There are sharp transitions, and this in fact creates some loss of local contrast. And what is a good idea in this case is to blur the mask a little bit with this. You see that now the mask is not so detailed, and the net result is that one can restore some local contrast where this mask is active. If I disable the blur, you get this, you see, and if I enable the blur again, you get a slightly more detailed image. Okay, so this is what we could achieve. I think it's a good starting point. I will stop here, and we will still be able to tune these parameters later on. Now let's just give this layer a more meaningful name, and we close this for the moment. Now what I want to do is also to increase the saturation of the image a little bit more. I want this nice autumn colors to really pop. So we add one more layer like that. We change the name to saturation, and again I double click here to get access to the controls, and now this time I will bump the saturation, and actually I want to bump it a lot at the beginning because I really want to show you the effect of what I will be doing. Now you see that this has increased the saturation everywhere. We get very nice red colors, probably not as nice as they should be because they are too much, but we will correct that. But we see also that these green colors have become quite strange, quite electric, and this is not really what we want to achieve. But again, we can use these curves to correct that. So this time I will use the curve that allows to modulate over the color of the image. Now I enable this curve, and I create some control points here, here, and here that I will just explain. So we want to have a maximum boost of the saturation in the red and up to the yellows, and we want to mute the saturation where we start to get into the green region. And in this here also we want still to get nicely saturated reds, but we want to reduce the effect where we start to reach the region of blue and magenta and the region of the sky. Okay, this looks a bit better now. Up. Okay. So let's see what is the effect of this mask. If I disable this curve, we see that this becomes really prominent, and if I enable the curve, we see that most of the colors that we wanted to boost here are still very much saturated, but the grass here comes back to a more normal color. Yeah, and now we can go down with the saturation until we are more satisfied with our results. Probably something like this, we will see. Now if I switch off this group, this edit group, we can see the overall effect of what we have done so far. Yeah? So that was our starting point, and now we are here. So I think it's already quite a good improvement. And again, for the saturation, we can tweak it a little bit more later. So let's close this. And now the final step I want to introduce is some brightening of this region here. I still feel it is a bit too dark, and we could increase a little bit more the contrast by brightening the top part of the tonal range. And since this is a more subtle adjustment compared to what we have done so far, I prefer to do that using a curve. So I choose this curves tool, and I double click to access the curve, and here it is. So what I want to do is to preserve the shadows and increase a little bit the values in the highlights, because this creates some nice tonal variation in this region here. And this is probably, as usual, a bit too much, but we can lower the effect like that, for example. Here it is. Now if I switch this layer off and back on, we can really see the effect of what we have done, and I think it's doing quite some improvement in this region here. But on the other hand, one can see that the sky gets a bit too much washed out, because we have bumped the highlights, and so we somehow lose the structure of the tonal structure in the clouds. Here you can see. So in fact, what I really would like to do is to apply this effect in the region of the trees, but preserve the sky. And to do this kind of local adjustment, one is possible by using masks which are associated to the layers. And to add a mask to this layer, we have to double click on this white rectangle here, and this will open a second tab where we can introduce again layers that in this case will act on the mask associated to this layer and not the image itself. So we are on this curves layer. If I switch it off, it's like that. If I switch it on, it's like that. And now, for example, I want to introduce some sort of gradient which makes the curve fully acting on this lower part and completely inactive in this upper part. So in this tab here, I add a layer. Now I go in this mask selection of tools, and I select the gradient. Voila. For the moment, it's not very easy to see what's going on exactly, but we will see how to see exactly the mask. Now I double click on the gradient and we see that now we can access all the parameters, and for example we can switch from a vertical to horizontal or radial gradients. And also here we see that we have again a curve that you will see will allow us to modulate the shape of the gradient so that we can create any sort of non-linear gradients if needed. But first of all, to show exactly how this gradient, so how this mask looks like, we can click on this push pin icon here, and now the preview image, when this is activated, will not show the result of the full processing, of the complete processing that we have introduced, but will show the result of the layer which is selected. Yeah? And in this case, since this layer is a mask, this mask is shown in a very specific way, where pure red means that the mask is dark, and when the mask is dark, it means that the effect to which the mask is associated is not applied. The mask is completely opaque. And where the mask is transparent means that the associated effect is applied to its maximum. And in between, where the mask is gray, the effect is applied proportionally to the gray value of the mask itself. So in fact now for the moment the mask is doing exactly the opposite of what we would like to do. It should be black on top and transparent on bottom, and this is where this curve here comes in hand, because if I do like that, I can, for example, invert the mask, and now you see that in fact I would like to have it transparent up to more or less here, so I can increase this point up to probably somewhere here, and now I want to have it completely dark in the top part, so I can do like that. Okay, we are almost there. Now the transition is a bit too fast, but also we see that this gradient is straight, while we would like to have it a bit more inclined, and this is possible. Now since we want to edit this gradient directly in the preview, we also have to activate this pencil icon, which allows to have a direct interaction with the tool using the mouse. And what I want to do, for example, is to take this corner here and move it up a little bit like that. Now you see that now my gradient follows quite nicely the shape of the trees, and now what I can do is to make it a bit more smooth, so we can lower a bit this point here and also make the transition on the top a bit smoother like this. And now I can introduce another point here to make the gradient a little bit more non-linear. Yeah? And now if I switch off this and this, I can see the effect of my gradient, or in fact I cannot see it, and this is a good sign, because it means that this mask is doing its job in a very subtle way. But now let's close this and close this tab, and we go back to the curves. Now let's see what is really the effect of this mask. With this button here, we can temporarily disable the application of the mask so that we can easily see the effect. So if I click here, the mask is ignored, and we see that the sky becomes brighter. And if I enable the mask, then the lower part stays the same, but the sky is not brightened and keeps the tonal structure in the clouds. And now probably we can still tweak things a little bit more and increase a bit the brightening in the trees like this. Okay, now I go back to this group and I switch it off to compare with our initial starting point. As you can see, we could do a quite good job on the image. I think there is still a little bit too much of a saturation, so we can go back to this tool here and put maybe 15 to bring the saturation down a little bit. And now I can just minimize this tool and double click on the contrast to see if we can also play a little bit with the contrast, if we have to increase it or reduce it. So maybe if we go up like that, I don't know, I probably stay as it was before. And now we close everything. Now the last step is to crop the image. I think in this image what is really interesting is this reflection of the trees on the water, and there is too much disturbing things around to my taste. So above this group, I click again on this button to add a layer. I choose Geom and crop image. And at the moment there is no cropping, so nothing has changed. But now if I double click here, again I have access to all the parameters of this tool, and in particular I can tell the tool that it should keep a given aspect ratio when doing the cropping, and in this case I want to keep an aspect ratio of 3:2. And now what I want to do is to draw my region on the image so that I can really easily tune it according to the composition. So again, to do that I have to click on this small pencil tool, and now if I click and drag with the mouse on the image, I can select the area which will be cropped like this, and then if I click inside and drag, I can move it around until I'm satisfied. So what I want to do is to remove all this part here, and now I can click on this corner to adjust it a little bit further, because I want to have the reflection more or less in the center of the composition. Okay, and now if I click on this icon again, I cannot anymore change the mask with the mouse, but now the preview shows the final result. And now I can close this, and here it is. So I think now the reflection is more or less in the middle as I wanted, and we have really focused the attention on what, in my opinion, is the nice thing in the image. And let me again go to this edit group and switch it off to see from where we started, and here is where we arrived. I think it's quite nice. And probably the last step I want to introduce is a little bit of a sharpening in the image. So I select this layer because I want to put the sharpening on top of my editing steps. Then I go to detail, sharpen, it's okay, and then again I double click here to see what options I have. We can here choose between two methods, the usual unsharp mask and a more complicated and time-consuming deconvolution method, but I will stick with this. And also we can tune the sharpening by acting on the radius of the sharpening tool. For example, if I put here 1.5, now the difference is not really big, but if I switch it off and back on, one can see the effect of the sharpening on the leaves and the structure of the trees, which gets quite enhanced, and maybe a bit too much, so I can now put here an opacity of 80 just to reduce the effect a little bit. Voila. Now this is the final image, and now after all this work, it would be really a pity not to be able to save what we have done, to eventually tweak the parameters again if we have new ideas. So I go here to save, and then I can choose a good name for my file with extension PFI, and I hit save, and the thing is saved immediately, because in fact what the program does is to create a text file which contains the description of all the steps that we have applied to the image, to the initial raw image. There is no data which is really image data which is really saved, and as a PFI file is a sort of sidecar file that has to always go together with the initial input file, which is stays untouched, is not modified. So every time you need your original file, and then the PFI file which contains all the editing steps, and then when PhotoFlow opens again a PFI file, it reads the description of the edit, and then it recreates all the layers and reapplies all the steps that we have applied. But of course you can also save your file to disk in a more common format with this export button, and there you can choose between TIFF files and JPEG files, and then if you again choose a meaningful name and you click save, then the file will be processed and exported to a JPEG that you can, for example, put on the web. Okay, so this is all for this first chapter of the PhotoFlow tutorial, and then in the next chapters I will go more in detail on the different tools that are available, and also on the creation of complex layer masks if you need. Bye bye.